Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming out, and welcome to Gillingham, the birthplace of Tirzah Garwood. So just wanted to have a brief word about the Circle of Six project. It's a project that's Arts Council funded, and it's to raise awareness about the lives of 6 extraordinary women with a connection to Gillingham. Women who were born, lived or worked in the Gillingham area, and particularly Tirzah Garwood is a particular fascination of mine, because I've just found out that I walked past the birthplace of Tirzah Garwood every day on my way to school, and I'm sure a few of us also did that. So you know, there's lots of people who will have a connection to her without even knowing it. So and this project was inspired by the 2012 London Olympics. I don't know if you know about, we had the Cultural Olympiad associated that, where there were a lot of cultural events, and I was doing research, and that's what led to this project. So anyway, so without further ado, I'm going to introduce our 2 speakers. We're going to have Nicole Mollett, who is giving the talk. She is a socially engaged artist whose work includes drawings, public art and performances using magic lanterns. In her work, she often creates collections of stories and fantastical realities using found archival images. Nicole's drawing practice is influenced by her Germanic ancestry, 16th and 17th century art, and the grotesque. She celebrates alternative histories and forgotten places, and she has worked on several regenerative projects across Kent and promotes a democratic and more inclusive approach to creative public art. And if you haven't already, I would definitely recommend that you go and visit the 6 beautiful murals that we have around in Jeffrey Street. So that's that. And before I introduce our young actor here, I just want to say, if you feel inspired tonight, I am commissioning 2 books. We're looking for a community creative response to the lives and work of these 6 women. So poems, stories, essays, letters, texts, tweets, and we're looking for people to send these entries in between the 1st of September and the 31st of October. I will be sending out some more information about this later. So anyway, the second speaker tonight, we have Tefet Meshadou. She is a young theatre practitioner who specialises in devised and immersive work. For the last year, she has worked for Icon Theatre and Theatre 21 as a youth theatre assistant, helping young people access arts-led education. She has recently gained a place in the National Youth Theatre and plans to begin training at the Guildford School of Acting in September. So thank you very much. I'm sure this will be a lovely night. Take it away, please. Thank you. Thank you.
So, hello and welcome everybody. I'd like to begin by starting where I began, which is back in January of this year, 2022, when I was awarded the 6 Women Public Art Commission for Medway. It was both an honour and a huge responsibility. I realised very quickly when I read the lives of these women and how important and significant they'd been. So I sat about researching all 6 women and realised also very soon that only one of them, like myself, was an artist. And this is the portrait you see here. Obviously you can go and see, as Sarah mentioned, it in Jeffrey Street. And this picture was based on 2 sources. One being a photograph by the Edwin Smith, taken in 1950, which was towards the end of her life. And the second being a painting by Duffy Ayres in 1944, when I like to think of her as being at the peak of her creative activity. Prior to working on this project, I knew almost nothing about Tirzah Garwood. When writing the biography, I Googled her, and I was surprised to find a wealth of fascinating work, including fine woodcuts, watercolours, exquisite marble papers, utterly enchanting paintings, and also 3D collages of houses and local architecture where she'd lived. So then it puzzled me, why had I not heard of this artist before now? Is it because of my lack of art history, I hadn't done my research properly? Or was it possible that Garwood's legacy has not received the rightful recognition it deserves, and if so, why? And so here we can see the Duffy Ayres painting. I particularly like this image of her because it seems quite sort of exaggerated, almost bordering on cartoonish, her exaggerated long neck and this fabulous hairdo. But when I learnt about her more as I read her autobiography, I realised it captures her spirit quite accurately. So the process of painting a portrait is a very strangely intimate experience. You're observing the fine details of basically a complete stranger. And in doing so, you're starting to wonder what their personality sits behind these features. Here I've just created a very brief timeline of Tirzah, just to give us an overview of her life. And to begin with, she was born here in Gillingham to a wealthy upper middle class family. She lived through no less than 2 world wars. She studied art, which was considered quite a privileged opportunity in those years for a young woman. She had 3 children with her first husband, Eric Ravilious. She then later on discovered she had breast cancer, is widowed at the age of 34. She marries again and dies shortly before her 43rd birthday. So in a nutshell, as an overview, her life is incredibly busy. She has a very itinerant life. She's constantly moving from one address to another. The main abodes where she lived were in Eastbourne and nearby Sussex, a place called Furlongs, then in London in several addresses, and then also most famously in Essex in a place called Bank House, where she lived together with the great Bardfield artists. In her life, she was also very hardworking, but also highly social. When you read the autobiography, she talks continuously of all these amazing parties and gatherings with various famous people and other artists. I mean, obviously, a lot of this is her personal life content, but for the sake of this talk, I wanted to really focus on her art because I feel like that's the thing that's constantly being sidelined when it comes to Tirzah. But unfortunately, or fortunately, her personal life is entirely intertwined with her work, and it impacts on her work. So therefore, it's kind of impossible to talk about her art without mentioning her personal life. And hopefully, in revealing the series of events that happened to her, we might be able to answer my first question as to why she didn't receive the recognition I believe she deserves. Okay, so this is my set of publications. Sorry, they won't be all lists. This is the final wordy slide. And this is the slide for the bibliophiles in the audience. So as you can see, the top 4 publications are actually the ones I managed to read. The most famous one being the autobiography, which, although Tirzah wrote the majority of it, her daughter Anne Ullman edited and published it, and the publishing only happened in 2012. So that already indicates why perhaps there wasn't recognition earlier than recently. Then secondly, a book by Andy Friend, which is actually really interesting. It's focusing on Ravilious and the group, but throughout that book, it's Tirzah's story that comes through again and again. So it's really interesting how she becomes instrumental because of her great account of the whole group of artists. She becomes instrumental in telling everybody's stories. And then thirdly, a curator called James Russell, he made a show back in 2018 at the Royal West of England Academy in Bristol, and this was all about artist couples and how their practices influenced each other. And just recently, a week ago, I found an article by a friend of hers called Olive Cook, and that was very informative in terms of her personality. Then further on from that, although I managed to get snippets online, these rare books were unfortunately slightly out of my reach, mostly because you can hardly get hold of them or they're incredibly expensive. But it's worth mentioning if you're interested in finding out more about her. So there were several catalogues to do with exhibitions that happened posthumously. And then finally, a book that's been recently published in 2020, again by her daughter Anne Ullman, and that's named after one of the paintings that I'm going to show you later on. And there's also a book coming out, so this is an exciting topic, it's growing. A young curator and writer called Lottie Crawford, it's just been announced a year ago, and it should be due in the next coming year, basically, and it's a sort of comprehensive view of her work and life again. And then I presume a lot of you might be aware there's a film about Eric Ravilious called Drawn to War, which has been released, and is basically doing very well. It's a sort of British independent film, but it keeps on having more and more screenings, so I very much recommend you go and watch that film. So, she was born on the 11th of April in 1908, and it states online and in her autobiography she was born in Kingswood Villas in Gillingham. I tried to find Kingswood Villas online, and unfortunately it didn't exist, so I then set about looking for evidence of it, and obviously I found this postcard, and you can clearly see it was sitting right next to the station, and luckily the original house is still standing. So I went to visit here, although there's no sign of her existence anymore, so presumably the owners of the house aren't aware of its famous residence. However, there are blue plaques to be found in various addresses she lived in London. So in Upper Mall Street in Hammersmith, where she lived at the start of her marriage with Eric between 1930 and 1932, there lies a blue plaque. And then also in Essex, at Bank House, where she lived between 1934 and 1941, there is a blue plaque. In this house, she lived with her older siblings, Margaret and then John Curry, and Tirzah was the middle child, with then Mary, Scott and Elizabeth following soon afterwards. From Chatham, the family moved to Glasgow. Then at the start of 1914, when First World War is declared, they moved to a place in the outskirts of Croydon, a place called Combe Farm, which still exists now. And they lived in various addresses, moving to 5 Arundel Road in Eastbourne on the 11th of April 1918, which was in fact Tirzah's 10th birthday. So here we see her parents. The father was called Frederick Scott Garwood, and he was a colonel in the Royal Engineers and served at Lewes and in Somme in 1915. And Tef is now going to read an excerpt that gives you a little insight into Tirzah's description of her father.
My father had a romantic nature and used before his marriage to fall in love very frequently, often with married women, and like a spaniel bringing a dead rabbit into the drawing room, he would lay the tribute of his unwanted adoration at their feet.
And now on to her mother. Her name is Ella Cora, and she was a daughter of an Irish shipbuilder. And her mother had a very different character to the father. In fact, Tirzah describes that her mother did not approve of suffragettes, and she was always outraged at any display of immodesty in women.
My mother was sentimental but not warmly affectionate. She did not like physical contact with other people, and only once in my life do I remember her allowing any public demonstration of affection between herself and my father.
However, on those two definitions alone, you might think that they were very different to Tirzah. But in fact, both of her parents were creative. When describing the family home in Eastbourne, where she grew up, Tirzah recalls that both her parents did painting, so the house was displayed entirely by their own works, 50% of which was from the father and the other half was from the mother, although she does comment that her father liked drawing nudes, which I thought was quite amusing. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about Tirzah's education, but I thought it would be useful to look at one of her later works called The Crocodile, because I believe this work might have been slightly inspired by her early education. And yeah, this is a woodcut, in fact. As you can see, there's a strong use of contrasts. There's also exaggerated perspectives and what I would call a slight optical illusion, because if you look at in the background the football goal, it looks like it's kind of back to front, almost like an Escher drawing, which I really like. And in this our first artwork from Tirzah, you can clearly see how she likes to observe human nature, and she likes to imbue her artworks with individuals' characters and emotions, as we observe the little girls chatting to one another and petting the small dog in the foreground. So Tirzah was educated at West Hill School in Eastbourne between 1920 and 1924, and then she moved on to Eastbourne School of Art in 1925, where she was taught under Reeves Falk and Oliver Senior. And then finally, obviously, meeting her future husband, Eric Ravilious. She moved then to Kensington in 1928, where she studied at the Central School of Art. Whilst growing up, she went often to the Natural History Museum in South Kensington, which she commented, "This I love doing, and I made drawings, always being careful that I was unobserved when doing so. I didn't like being watched." She also had a early leaning towards being very critical of other artists. When a relative of hers took her to the Tate Gallery to see the Turners, she said, "The Tate Gallery has rather overdone the Turners. We saw far too many of them. Privately, John and I thought them boring, with the exception of the Fighting Temeraire." So you can clearly see from early on she has quite assertive and strong opinions. She was also self-critical of herself, of her own work. She says, "At my various schools, I have always been considered good at drawing, but my drawings by now were pretty bad because they were no longer innocent but influenced by the storybook illustrations of that period." So when she goes to the art school in Eastbourne, she describes this moment as being one of the most awfully happy moments of her life because she's able to draw in paint all day. And there she grows in confidence and ability, gaining a strong sense of her own style. And that is also where she meets her future husband, Eric. She mentions how he likes her drawings and engravings of people, and that how he is mostly interested in landscape drawing. Thus, their work is not similar, and that pleases him because he doesn't like to think of students imitating his work. Their relationship begins first as a friendship. He is, of course, her tutor and 5 years senior, so she was wary of his charm at first. She notes also that he's not quite a gentleman. Coming from a working class background obviously means that he's not a suitable candidate for her. So Tirzah starts to date a guy called Bob. Bob's father was an old friend of Tirzah's father. He was studying to be a civil servant and was going to Africa to work on his first job. The family approved of this match, but sadly Tirzah was never truly in love with him. As she puts it,
Bob asked me to marry him, and I promptly replied, "Of course not. I wasn't thinking of marrying anyone then. I was only 18 and wanted to go on with my drawing and engraving."
She made, however, a promise to stay true to Bob, and they commenced on a long-distance relationship with lots of letters to and from Africa. And she promised also to him to not marry anyone else. So thus begins a period of her slowly but surely being charmed by Eric, whilst also somewhat still being attached to Bob. The friendship develops and they fall in love, and it becomes a passionate relationship as that.
After seeing one another again, the summer was forgotten and we resumed our friendship and lovemaking almost as though nothing has happened, the only visible change being the moustache that he had grown. London is a difficult place for making love if you haven't very much money and don't like joining the couples in Hyde Park. We could only snatch kisses behind cases in the museums, dodging the attendants who were far too numerous, or sit in cinemas and afterwards stroll about the more secluded places like Holland Walk and the passages between Kensington and Notting Hill Gate. But they were pretty thickly populated by other couples.
So when she finishes with the Eastbourne School of Art, Tirzah begs and pleads her parents to let her move to London. And eventually they give in, realising that she's very passionate about her career in art. And so she moves into a boarding house for girls, but she's still under the watchful eye of two aunties who live close by. It's during this period she meets a lady called Miss Douglas, who I believe is affiliated with the art school, who offers to read her palm, and Tirzah agrees, being a curious nature. And Miss Douglas accurately foretold many events in Tirzah's life, including that her future husband would be an extraordinary character. But she also would not be living with him for the latter part of her life, but didn't explain how. She also, I found more interestingly, gave a character assessment of Tirzah in which she says,
"She said that I was very well balanced and that although my judgments and opinions would probably be sound, people would not believe me, because I could not express myself with the necessary assurance which would carry my conviction. It is true, I'm very rarely respected and then never for very long. Perhaps it is because I don't wish to be."
Yeah. So that last final line for me is quite significant. However, on further connections with Eric and him introducing her to various curators, she gets invited to be a part of the 8th annual exhibition of the Society of Wood Engravers. And this is quite a significant thing to happen to her. It's actually happening in the Redfern Gallery in Mayfair in 1927, and she's just 19 years old. And here you see a copy, which the original is down there, I've done of one of the artworks she had in this exhibition. It's entitled Spring, and it was part of a 4-season series. And she received praise in the Time for this wood print. The Times newspaper wrote about her in great praise, so that, quite a good thing to happen to a young girl. And when you look at this image, I just thought I'd point out a few things, because in copying it, I noticed things that hadn't first appeared to me. So obviously, her take on spring being slightly obtuse. You would think of spring as being something to do with new life and joy and like nature, but instead she chooses to depict 2 women doing spring cleaning, like on their hands and floors, scrubbing the decks. Then, secondly, I noticed the wallpaper. It doesn't come out first, but it has this sort of like menacing quality. It kind of looks a bit like a flock of birds or bats, like coming in to sort of attack the women. And then lastly, I noticed the bedstand. As I was drawing, it seems to have this kind of face in it, like a pumpkin or something. And it's almost as if the task is laughing back at the woman, mocking them for their sort of endless attempts at making the room tidy. So yeah, I quite enjoyed this piece, and also it has a sort of a sense of foretelling the future for Tirzah, because later on you'll see a lot of her work was put to one side because she had many domestic commitments and work to do, and I felt it's quite strange that her very first image to become in a public exhibition was of 2 ladies doing the cleaning. Leading on from the success of these works, she was commissioned by the BBC to produce 3 engravings for the Pilgrim's Progress. Tirzah describes the news of hearing about this commission as
a wonderful, wonderful evening when I was asked to do my first job. I danced round the room with joy. I managed to earn enough money not to feel that I was costing my parents any more than if I had been at home.
And so, as their relationships grows in strength, Tirzah eventually gets married to Eric in 1930, but of course her parents did not approve. When Eric approaches him and sends him a letter to ask his hand in marriage, her father writes to Tirzah saying he didn't like thinking of his daughter developing into a domestic drudge. This is actually a picture that Eric made based on Tirzah, and it's for a book published by the Almanac. And it's depicting one of the signs of the zodiac, in fact Libra. And I just realised from reading another article yesterday that in the background are the Libra sort of balancing symbols behind the shed. And so here we see Eric and Tirzah newly married, and I think you can see in this photograph that there's quite a kind of rapport between them, and fond kind of banter going between them.
Eric used to flatter me a lot. He liked to think that his wife was incomparably better than any other wife, and he had a great variety of nicknames for me, such as Miss Foulhouse, Beast Garwood, Chunko, Chunkleberry, Beast, Tushpig, Smart Alec, Tushbags, or just plain Bags.
And so the comedy extends into their work, and again, the kind of interrelatedness of both of their practice. This is actually from the Towner Gallery in Eastbourne, and the catalogue description explains that the front of the piece of paper is a Ravilious drawing of men climbing rigging on a ship, and the reverse is Tirzah's, so they're even sharing the same piece of paper. And here we see Tirzah drawing quite comical, naive images of what I presume is sausage dogs. And if anybody is familiar with a sausage dog, you'll realise that they're quite strange and humorous characters. And I like to think that this sketch is an early sketch for another example of her woodcut prints. And this one is entitled The Dog Show, and it shows people prepping their dogs in advance of a display. Other examples of her woodcut artworks And I'll just describe them because I haven't got the images to show you. But there's one called the window cleaner, where you have a gentleman, a window cleaner at a window, gazing into a room, and a man is obviously working at a desk writing something, and the window cleaner is basically reading his text, sort of being a bit nosy. And then another one in this series is called the Hypochondriac, and there you have an elderly lady lying in bed with a sort of a circle of women in front of her being her audience. The title suggests that she might be leading them on slightly. So in all of these artworks, she seems to be depicting human vulnerability and weakness. This I find quite interesting. Going back to the humour aspect, much later in her biography, she talks about humour as if it were one of her philosophies. She says, "Personally, I believe strongly in the theory that laughter and humour are divine attributes. It was certainly that capacity for self-conscious humour that had made man so much more remarkable a creature than other animals." Now, again, we're going back to Eric's work, but I'll explain to you why I'm showing this, because it becomes quite a significant moment in both their lives. So this is actually a sketch for a commission that Eric gets just before they get married, and then it goes on to being like released or unveiled in the year that they get married. And it's for a place called Morley College in London. And Eric was collaborating with his fellow friend Edward Bowden on this project. But this is one of Eric's designs because they kept their walls separate. So it was a bit of a competition going between them who can make the best artworks. And in this design here, you can see the lady going up the steps in the middle is apparently based on Tirzah, as Anne explains in the autobiography. And also, quite interestingly, because obviously this being Eric's work, you can clearly see how the artwork seems to appear like a doll's house. And later on in Tirzah's work, a lot of the time you see architecture and especially doll's houses being depicted. So again, there's this connection between both their practices. And so, yeah, anyway, this artwork took them 2 years. It was lots and lots of work. And at the final launch, the Prime Minister of the time came to unveil it. And it was so successful, it basically launched Eric's career. And in fact, the good reviews meant that the Queen got to hear of it, and the Queen was interested in doll's houses at the time, so she also came to see it. So you can imagine what that created a dynamic within their relationship, because obviously Eric was now famous. And also at the launch of this commission, they decided to invite Tirzah's parents along. So that evening, not only was the launch of his big career, but it was also the time he first met the in-laws, which I find quite amusing. Oh, and according to Eric Bowden, this is on the opposing wall. It is painted by Eric, and it depicts Venus rising, but it's actually based on Tirzah. So as we can see from this particular detail of the artwork, that he's positioning Tirzah as the goddess of love. So obviously their relationship is going quite strong. And so following on from that commission, Eric gets awarded another commission by the architect Oliver Hill, and this is to paint the tea room walls in the Midland Hotel in Morecambe. And they commenced this work in 1933. And according to Anne, Tirzah's daughter, this was very much a 50-50 collaboration between Tirzah and Eric. It officially is Eric's project, but it's Tirzah, Anne suggests, that did more than her fair share of the work. And so I believe this experience of this project was her first foray into public art and working at scale. And as you know, if any of you have done art projects, there's a very huge difference between making an artwork on a tiny piece of paper and then turning it into something that covers the 360 of a giant tea room. So, and as to be expected, things don't exactly run to plan. So, for instance, when they arrive, Tirzah, they all assumed that they'd be able to stay in the hotel, but the hotel was still a building site. So on that very day, they had to go around the Morecambe town to try and find some emergency accommodation. But then following on from that...
We were annoyed when we discovered that we couldn't start work, as the wall hadn't yet had 3 undercoats of white paint that it should. we should have to wait a whole week in this sad town that was only meant for visitors in the proper seasons. Now it lay like a sluttish prostitute who hadn't yet bothered to get out of bed and paint her face.
It's a bit of a harsh criticism for a place you've never been to before, but nonetheless, it happened, and you will see an amazing image was created. And actually, so I've read, it was a full 180 room, and it started at light, as in day, and then it goes through to night. And you can see the line of the horizon is being cleverly cut up by all these very simple architectural forms. And I find it a very accomplished, almost minimalistic image for those days. And this is an image taken in 2003, just before, sadly, the mural was taken down and the whole entire hotel was rebuilt. As you can see on the ceiling, there's some water damage, and very luckily got hold of this image because as the colours make a real difference. But just the simple richness and the way they're describing the fireworks here on the right is quite fantastical. So now we move further on into her life. As you can see, a very significant thing happens to her. She has her children. Her first son, being John, was born in 1935. And this obviously changed her commitment somewhat. And she had the struggle to balance her life, her work life, with her family life. Later on, she had her son James in 1939 and Anne much later on in 1941. But here we're looking at John. The novelist Robert Harling, who knew her well, writes in a posthumous catalogue, the manifold talents of Tirzah as a wood engraver, artist and designer, especially of exquisite marble papers, were well known to her friends, but have been virtually extinguished by the steadily growing fame of Ravilious' achievements. Tirzah was content for this to be so, for she was uncommonly and genuinely modest and a devoted wife and mother, but as far as her work was concerned, she certainly lost out. So that was obviously his opinion, but it seems that she took on board and loved being a mother quite sincerely. So prior to her first son being born, obviously the honeymoon period of their marriage starts to waver slightly, and when they're living in Essex and with the great Barnfield artists, often other artists would come and stay for periods of time with them. And at that location, a lady called Diana Lowe came to stay. And Tirzah describes her first arrival in the group. And she said immediately she could see Eric fell in love with her. But what's remarkable, alongside that comment, she says, and I don't blame him, she was amazing. She was, so attractive and outgoing. So she immediately empathizes with him, even though it hurts her. Further on from that, he has another affair with a Helen Binion, who was also one of the artists. And Tirzah knew about both affairs, and they were honest and open throughout with one another about these experiences. As Tirzah wrote,
I felt rather strange, but not unduly disheartened. An unforeseen result was a shower of criticism for Eric. I was no fun and did nothing but housework, and I hadn't any initiative and didn't go off and do things by myself.
Yeah, so that was Eric's opinion. But you can see, nonetheless, she's enjoying being a mother. And it's worth saying alongside this that Tirzah has her own bit on the side, if you like, with another artist called John Aldrich. And she falls also in love with him. So for a period, Eric and Tirzah are effectively living together, but being in love with other people. But this doesn't stop them supporting one another and having more children. But however, one thing that really stood out for me in reading Tirzah's autobiography was that it was in fact art that kept her going, as she puts,
I don't seem to be put out by misfortunes as much as most people. Possibly this is because I am habitually lucky enough to be completely absorbed in drawing or writing, so that I become quite unconscious of people or time when I am working. So there is always that escape from reality.
Yeah, so it goes without saying, and in many collections this is seen as her foremost art, Tirzah was a master at making marbled papers. And for those who aren't familiar with how the process of marbled papers is, how they're created, I've got a short description of the way in which Tirzah achieved these effects. She filled a large shallow dish, sink or portable bath with water and added a little flour to thicken it. Onto this she dropped a brush full of oil paint thinned with linseed oil and stirred the water until it became uniform in colour and thus creating patterns. And onto the water she laid the paper, which then absorbed the ink, and you ended up with your marbled paper. Marbling gave her great pleasure. She was highly successful. She features, as I said, in many collections, including the V&A. Her marbled papers were bought by Everyman Press, and they feature in the end papers of small editions of poetry, etc. Her marble papers were sold at the Dunbar Hay shop in London in the middle to end of the 1930s. And it was a great way of her earning money because obviously as World War I began, the need for limited edition art prints was going down, whereas marble papers as a craft object, they could be used for multiple purposes, and including, I didn't even realise this was the case, but they were used to make lampshades, which I quite liked the idea that there was functional art. Later on, a chap called Oliver Simon from Kirvan Press, he wrote to Tirzah in trying to entice her to London, saying he was going to include her in a publication, an article all about the great marbling artists in the UK. However, when she got there, she realised he wanted her to do it for free and not be paid. And so she was most, insulted, as she puts it. Yeah, because he says, "I'll make you famous. I did not wish to be well known, and I hated that kind of life led by successful people. After a cup of tea and a biscuit, I left, feeling pretty indignant being brought all the way to London for this." Now, I don't have a slide for this, but it's important. So during the war, as so often happens in hard times, you sense in the autobiography, there was a coming together again of Eric and Tirzah. They put aside their other foibles and relationships, and they were very supportive. It was also, at that time, Eric was commissioned to be a war artist, so he had to go away a lot. He very exciting challenges, but nonetheless meant he left Tirzah alone with the children, she had a lot on her plate. But then sadly in 1942 she was diagnosed with breast cancer. At first they just found a small lump, but they removed that, and unfortunately it still grew again, so she had to undergo a mastectomy. So Eric returned to support her and keep her company and help her with the children. During that period again, within 3 months, she becomes pregnant, and her doctors sadly advise her that she's not well enough to carry the baby to term, so she underwent an abortion. After the abortion, she was recovering in hospital, and Eric was awarded another commission, this time to go away to Iceland. And so they only get a week alone together before he has to leave on a plane. And I thought, even though this is not necessarily a depiction of this significant moment in her life, I thought it was an appropriate painting to use for it. The moment in which they say goodbye to each other in her autobiography is quite moving, so I thought it would be good to read her account. He felt awful. She was obviously recovering from not one but 2 operations, and he felt awful leaving her in the morning. So he asks her, "Shall I not go?" But she replies, "No, I shall be all right." And they both say, "I love you," and he departs. And as she watches him walking down the lane, she knows this might be the last time she ever sees him. And so he takes a plane to Iceland, and just 4 days after arriving, he joins a flight on the 2nd of September at 5:06 in the morning, and him and the 4 other crew members unfortunately perish as the plane crashes into the ocean. He's just 39 years old when he dies. And looking at this painting, I can't help but think Tirzah, so this is obviously done 6 years after that event, but I can't help but feel that she's slightly reflecting on that moment. As you notice in the foreground, there's these beautiful spring flowers and everything seems joyful, but even the butterfly seems to have more strength and power than the man in the small plane. On observing it closer, the wooden sticks of the plane, they almost look like matchsticks, like they're going to break. And I can't help but feel she's contemplating Eric's death, but also perhaps the vulnerability of man in general. And I find it a very beautiful painting. And here we have a painting called The Orchid Hunters, also done in the same period. It's worth noting, though, in that latter part of her life, after she's recovered from breast cancer to begin with, she meets a man called Henry Swansea, and they get married in 1946. He is a radio producer for the BBC and an interesting man in his own right. He was actually instrumental in the famous BBC radio programme called Caribbean Voices between 1946 and 1945. And this programme drew attention to West Indian writers and poets, raising the profile of many now well-respected writers. This is also me making a sweeping assumption, but I can't help but think that perhaps her connection with Henry might have influenced her interest in this further afield. I don't believe she went to Brazil. And it's worth noting that orchid hunters were a really big thing in the Victorian times. There is in fact a craze titled orchid delirium because they were of so great value. And they were a coveted symbol of wealth and power, but hunting for them was a dangerous business. And this is actually a copy again, because I couldn't access all the paintings I wanted to, but I found this a significant painting to talk about. And my work experience student, who I had with me a couple of weeks ago, Harriet Stepinski, kindly drew a copy of the painting for me. And if you look at the painting, in the foreground you see a doll's house, which is mostly like bright red and yellow, and it's surrounded by this lush greenery all around it in ivy. At first glance, when you look at the painting, it seems to show a child's playthings left discarded on the floor mid-game. A toy soldier with a bearskin hat wearing a bright red Royal Welsh Fusilier uniform. He is lifeless on the floor. Another soldier points a gun down at the floor, whilst a woman, perhaps a maid or a wife, is glancing down from the balcony above. What we witness is a moment of drama suspended. The prettiness of the greenery in the doll's house is strongly contrasted to what seems a brutal murder. There is a sense of something more sinister at play in this image. Is she again reflecting on World War II, or perhaps Eric's death, or just the futility of war in general? I don't know. And now here we see the Hornet with Wild Roses painting, on which the latest publication has been named after. This is a good example about how many of her late works were often, she adopts the perspective of a child, looking out at the adult world and observing the detail of insects and plant life. Olive, Tirzah's good friend, comments that in the final year of her life, she completed no less than 20 paintings, which is remarkable considering she was then yet again ill with a recurrence of the cancer. Olive says she was courageous and joyful despite her illness, and declaring that this year was the happiest year of her life. And now we see my favourite painting, which is entitled The Suffragettes House. And as you look at it closer and you see these odd doll-like figures which are constructed out of twigs or perhaps matchsticks, dancing uniformly around a central object, which is in fact a doll's house. It seems like their motions are almost robotic or ritualistic. One exception is the woman in red. Is she the odd one out or the outsider? Is she perhaps Tirzah or a suffragette? I don't know. I believe she's commenting somehow on perhaps gender roles and the imbalance that she lived through in gender roles in her lifetime. You know, perhaps it's some sort of reflection on domestic chores and this sort of endlessness of it. But I'll leave that to you to decide. This painting is entitled The Spanish Lady. And as far as my records are concerned, I believe it's one of the last paintings that she painted. What we see is a solitary figure in the centre of the image, a ceramic ornament who stands alone, gazing out into the distance. The overall effect of the painting has a harmonious mood. She's framed by flowers. There is a small snail slowly moving around the edge of a flower pot in the foreground. But if we look closer at her face, we notice the expression. She is calm and deep in thought. The owl behind her is perhaps a symbol for wisdom or mental strength. I feel that this final work by Tirzah is when she's coming to terms with her predicament and knows she's soon going to die. She's looking back at all her experiences and what she's achieved with a certain amount of acceptance and letting go. And here we now move to her final resting place. Tirzah died suddenly and without pain on Easter Monday morning on the 27th of March 1951, 2 weeks short of her 43rd birthday. She's buried in the churchyard at Copford in Essex. The headstone is inscribed Tirzah Swansea, 1908 to 1951, and Eric Ravilious, Lost in the Atlantic. Blessed are the eyes which see the things that ye see. And it's worth noting that obviously Henry, her second husband, would have been the one responsible for this. And it's quite, I think, a sign of his good character that he chose to put Eric on the gravestone with Tirzah, even though it was his wife. And it also brings them together yet again as a kind of collaborative duo. And the statement making a point of saying that artists have a valid contribution to society in that they're showing our world back to us is quite a beautiful, moving statement. And here we are back at Geoffrey Street. And I'd like to end by firstly referring back to two people who knew Tirzah very well. Her good friend Olive Cook wrote in an article in The Matrix, one aspect of her personality as Tirzah was the sense of adventure, a rare distinction and a faint intriguing aloofness felt in her company. After an absence of close 40 years, her presence remains extraordinarily and poignantly clear. Light-boned and quick-moving, she has the figure of a Botticelli angel, a pale, mobile, rather long face framed in wavy brown hair, a wide mouth and a dark, vivid eyes, shining with intelligence and full of half-mocking humour. Her sharp awareness and relish of human oddities and foibles, the caustic wit and occasional dottiness which delighted her friends, were combined with qualities more characteristic of Eileen than of Tirzah. The most disarmingly simple-heartedness, absolute integrity, and a surprising regard for propriety. And my second person who I feel perceived her very well was a lady called Lynn Abbey, and she writes a blog called I Prefer Reading, and there she states, Tirzah's story is important, not just as a portrait of a group of artists in the interwar years, but also as a profoundly clear-eyed and honest description of the life of a woman artist, with all its difficulties and disappointments, as well as satisfactions and the joy. So to answer my original question as to why she hasn't received enough recognition as I believe she deserves, I believe the reason why she didn't get it is that perhaps she didn't want fame. She wasn't what I would define as a career artist. She didn't prioritise publicity over the actual making of the work. And she focused on making stuff she really wanted to make and what she enjoyed making. And in that sense, she's a true artist. And although her husband was obviously more successful than her in his lifetime, she saw his success as her success. And they, in fact, obviously collaborated very often. So she took great pride in his achievements. But just because she didn't receive recognition in her lifetime, there's no reason why she shouldn't receive it posthumously now. And I think it's only right we finish with Tirzah's voice.
I hope, dear reader, that you may be one of my descendants. But as I write, a German aeroplane has circled round above my head, taking photographs of the damage that yesterday's raiders have done, reminding me that there is no certainty of our survival. If you are not one of my descendants, then all I ask of you is that you love the country as I do. And when you come into a room, discreetly observe its paintings, its pictures and its furnishings, and sympathise with the painters and craftsmen.
Fantastic. Well, I would just like to say thank you very much, Nicole, for a wonderful talk. Thank you very much to FET for your wonderful reading. I would like to thank the staff of Medway Libraries for helping out, Sandra, Tina, and, of course, Marvellous Bob. I'd like to give thanks to the Tirzah Garwood Estate, Eric Ravilious, Anne Ullman, the Towner Art Gallery, Bridgeman Images, and the Victoria and Albert Museum. Thank you all very much for coming tonight. Thank you, peers, and thank you for watching.